what we have is a panel of people that have done direct service provision for survivors of labor trafficking. What we do know from both the research and then anecdotally from around the state is that we actually have more labor trafficking cases, we have more labor trafficking victims than sex trafficking cases and victims. And we'll talk about that. I'll ask each one of our panelists to reflect a little bit about that our labor trafficking in particular hides in plain sight, and how it is that we need to actually get a better handle on how much labor trafficking has become a part of our everyday economy here in Florida. So we'll ask each one of the folks here to talk about their experiences, what it is that they do as their organizations that they're a part of, and where they see the state of Florida moving. What is it that we need to do to better combat this kind of trafficking that we're seeing actually routinely in so many of the workplaces around the state? Let me start. Kathleen, you want to just introduce yourself briefly and then tell a little bit about how it is that you've interacted with the trafficking issues?
Okay, my name is Kathleen Moskowiak. I'm a supervising attorney at Gulf Coast Legal Services. So Gulf Coast Legal Services is a legal aid organization. We're based in St. Petersburg in the Tampa Bay area. And in our organization, we have an immigration unit. We focus on victims of crime. So domestic violence, but also victims of human trafficking, both labor and sex trafficking. But my focus in my unit is for the foreign-born victims. In terms of labor trafficking and my interaction, we represent them directly. And we represent them directly in their immigration proceedings, as well as if there's corollary events like Department of Labor. So oftentimes, well, I guess I should say maybe half of the time in my cases, the Department of Labor is involved as well in terms of perhaps a settlement with a recruiting agency or with the employer that the person was trafficked by. I don't know how long you want me to drone on, so I just didn't know if you were going to
We will come back to you.
Introduce yourselves. Okay.
That's great. My name is Terry Kuhn, and I direct the Human Rights Center at Florida State University. We're an academic center, but we do a lot of advocacy work. We provide actually hands-on pro bono care, much like Kathleen and a number of the service providers do here, for both survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, especially around the state of Florida. And that sort of victim-based perspective is what informs a lot of our teaching, our research, and also a lot of the legislative work that we've done in recent years as well. Jennifer?
Hi everybody, my name is Jennifer Marks and I'm with World Relief Tampa. And what we do is we provide overall case management and support to human trafficking survivors, and that encompasses foreign-born as well as domestic, men, women, children, and adults. We directly service adults as well in that process. So it's really about their recovery process is the big role that we play as an organization.
Hi, my name is Regina Bernadin. I'm the program manager of the anti-trafficking program for the International Rescue Committee in Miami. We're also a humanitarian organization founded by Albert Einstein in the 1930s, and we've had an office in South Florida since the 1960s helping refugees and asylees, and we started our human trafficking department in 2003. Our work is very similar to Jennifer pointed out her organization does, and that we do the support services. Our initial focus was helping foreign-born individuals, but actually as of this month we'll begin working also as well with domestic trafficking victims. One thing that we did this past year is sort of like a demographics project, just looking to see the ages of the survivors who we assist, the nationalities, and we looked at the type of trafficking, and it was very surprising, but it shouldn't be, seen that it mirrors or reflects what's being seen throughout Florida, that the majority of the survivors that we've assisted, or more than half definitely, are survivors of labor trafficking and not sex trafficking, as we originally thought, based on statistics that talk about the fact, or did for many years, that sex trafficking was more prevalent. We're starting to see that, what we're seeing is more labor than anything else.
Good. And Laura?
Hi, my name is Laura Germino. I direct the anti-slavery campaign with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which is an organization of farm workers based in Immokalee in South Florida. And I actually have worked with Regina on a few cases now. We have been working on forced labor cases since the early 90s, primarily with farm workers who've been forced to work against their will in the fields through due to violence by their employers or threats of violence. And these are multi-state, multi-worker cases. Can range from 15 workers at a time to 600. And we work on investigation due to our networks, and we'll get cases reported to us, as well as been collaborating with law enforcement on prosecution. We do training for law enforcement and non-governmental organizations. We do education with both workers and consumers. That was our museum outside that some of you all might have gone through, that's there till 6 tonight. And we also have reached the level of prevention with a group of farms, tomato growers in the Fair Food Program, where we've actually reached a level where we're preventing the cases from happening, rather than cleaning up after it's already, the abuse has already occurred. Thank you.
And we'll go back to Laura on a couple different points that she mentioned there. One of the things we've discovered, and we've seen this around the state for a number of years now, is that our economy is really infested with human trafficking. It's permeated a lot of the different sectors of our Florida economy. We've seen cases in hotels, in resorts, in restaurants, in our agriculture sector. We're starting to see them in nail salons. We're starting to see them in construction sites. There's been a host of different labor trafficking kinds of contexts in which we're starting to understand that as the dark side of globalization, when, again, we as American consumers try to get more and pay less, oftentimes that will involve trafficking at some kind of level, that it's part of the delivery of either services or products to our tables. That in that way, many of us, actually all of us, are somehow complicit in trafficking. And it's the question of how do we actually root this out? How do we identify where trafficking actually occurs within our own lives and within the larger state of Florida as well? If I could start, maybe, Regina, if we could start with you, say a word. What are differences or commonalities between the sex trafficking that gets a lot of headlines, and rightfully so, but really labor trafficking, which maybe gets less headlines, but which needs far more attention?
In the context of the service provision?
Service provision, sure.
Okay. I think that's actually one of the things. A lot of times people think, well, the needs of sex trafficking survivors are different than the needs of labor trafficking survivors. Well, one of the things, and if I had to answer this as a yes or no question, the answer would be yes or no. I mean, in the sense of a lot of times you see in labor trafficking situations that there is sexual exploitation or sexual abuse. So it might not have been commercial, but it's still there and present. So a lot of times you will be providing a survivor of labor trafficking with the same exact services as a sex trafficking survivor, whether it is the trauma counseling, the medical health screenings, and so forth. There are some needs that you might see, for example, a survivor of labor trafficking in agricultural sector that you might not see with other sex trafficking survivors, such as, for example, burns from pesticides or those specifically medical needs. However, each individual case, whether it's sex trafficking or it's labor trafficking, it's individual. Each person has different needs. And so while you might find that one particular case of labor trafficking might not, whether it's domestic servitude or in construction or another industry, might be different from the next, you will see that the same with sex trafficking survivors, not all the needs. As someone once said to me, and I thought that was very interesting, someone who might experience a traumatic event might not, one person might be experiencing trauma and one just lived through a traumatic event. People handle situations differently, so the needs are going to be different as well.
And clearly there's huge amounts of trauma that our labor trafficking survivors undergo and experience.
Exactly.
We focus so much on the sex trafficking, and it's horrific, but our labor trafficking victims have much of the same trauma.
Exactly.
And understandably, we have to be able to respond better to that. A question for Jennifer. Jennifer, of course, works for World Relief, and again, a key part of our Tampa Clearwater Task Force. Again, a model task force that is actually training other task forces around the country. What's the role of World Relief within that task force, and what types of victims are you actually encountering?
Within the task force, I think that we're really fortunate here in the Tampa Bay region that even in the last couple of years, this task force keeps growing. It keeps getting more cohesive and increasingly structured in a way that we're able to pull people in to the various components that need to be addressed. Because whenever I go out and speak about human trafficking, I always equate it in my mind, because I like to cook, to an onion. Because an onion has so many layers, layer after layer after layer, but yet when you get to the core, it's really all about exploiting a vulnerability, And so within the task force, we're working closely with all of our community partners, because the needs are so great for labor trafficking as well as sex trafficking victims. We rely upon our community partners. There are so many health-related needs, psychological needs, and we simply don't have, no one has enough resources for this if we don't come together as a community. And as a recent example of that, we have individuals that have just, it's just become, through hearing something in the media or talking to someone and having a conversation, someone becomes aware of the trafficking issue and they want to get engaged, and then they might come to the task force meeting, and then they may meet someone from our team there and say, hey, how can I plug in? What difference can I make? We recently had a trauma counselor that did this, and now she's on a pro bono basis serving some of our clients. And in terms of the labor trafficking population, I would full-heartedly agree that the trauma needs are as severe as any other client, although sometimes we find that the willingness or because there are a lot of cultural components that go into whether or not someone is open to going there. And sometimes there's even a difference between men and women, whether or not they're willing to or desiring to kind of get the therapy that they of course would need, but they have to obviously be a willing participant in that process. And you sort of have to be guided, and getting back to what you were mentioning, that each individual is unique. Each client is unique. Each labor trafficking victim is unique and may be coming from a variety of different places and experiences. So you really have to also follow their lead in terms of their recovery, what their goals are, what's most important to them. And oftentimes with our labor trafficking victims, the most important thing in the world to them is making sure that their family's okay, making sure that they can send resources back, and make sure that they may have a child thousands of miles away that they can maybe see on Skype, and maybe they haven't seen that child in years and years. And the most important thing in the world to them is that that child's okay. They're not even focusing on their needs, sometimes to the degree that we want them to be, to really make sure that they get all the care that they deserve. But, it's a process.
That's great. And pointing out that there's a whole range of needs. When we think especially of our labor trafficking victims, many of them are here in Florida or here in the United States doing the jobs that U.S. citizens don't want to do, choose not to do. Whether that is picking tomatoes in Immokalee, whether it's working in construction, in restaurants, any number of different things. Let me turn to Kathleen. As an immigration attorney, Kathleen, what are the kind of particular needs that you see among foreign national labor trafficking victims? And in general, what does an immigration attorney do to combat human trafficking?
You mean the needs in terms of...
Yeah, what do you do for labor trafficking victims?
Oh, okay, all right. As the immigration attorney, I represent them in their immigration proceedings. So most of the time what I see are victims, survivors of labor trafficking that haven't yet been placed in deportation proceedings. That's not always the case, but in my particular situation, right now, for instance, I have about 6 survivors that I'm working with, and by the way, all of them are labor. All of them are labor trafficking. I don't actually have a sex trafficking client right now. And of those 6, 3/4 of them are male. None of them are in deportation proceedings, so it's an affirmative filing on behalf of the Immigration Service to get their T visa. So these individuals are eligible for relief in our immigration system in the forms of a T visa. That's good for 4 years if they are successful in that, and we represent them in those proceedings. Like I said, I also get involved in the Department of Labor if there is that sort of situation that's going on to get, sometimes they're owed settlement checks from whatever situation that they're in, and so we deal with that as well.
Good. A question, maybe if we can look down to Laura there. We talk about human trafficking oftentimes as hiding in plain sight. Are labor trafficking cases more difficult or less difficult to identify? Laura, when you think of like the 20 years, really, this is not a new issue, especially in the agricultural area in Florida. What is it that characterizes these cases?
Well, it's interesting because they can be in plain sight and yet almost like in a parallel universe. We had one case where workers were being held against their will in the orange groves, but right next to them was a retiree type of community, golf seniors, and it wasn't that they agreed with what was going on. They had no idea that it was occurring. And it can be because many of the signs of what would be just let's say an exploitative job or a not very nice job to have, low wages, poor working conditions, can be very close on the spectrum to actual forced labor, modern day slavery, being held against your will. It's very hard to tease that out. But it's almost like when you have a radio station and there's static and you tune to the right station, then you can hear, it's that kind of, once you have learned those signs, then you can work through, oh, all of a sudden it's all very clear what's going on. And none of these are absolute or definitive indicators, but they go towards it, which is when you have control over, when the employer has control over your transportation, your job, and your housing, and rides to and from work, and communication with the outside world, and controls your access to visitors, you start seeing that you could have employer-provided housing. That's not in and itself dispositive or definitive that something wrong is going on, not at all. But once it all starts going together into this web, then you think, well, we need to start asking some questions.
And Laura, if we could, I think of the role that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers has played really in the last 20 years in not only assisting the victims, the survivors of these cases, but actually identifying the cases and working with the feds in prosecuting the cases. I think of, again, the Cuello case or the Flores case from the 90s, then you've had the Ramos case, the Navarrete case. I mean, a host of cases that continue to pop up. Could you maybe walk it through for our folks? What are these cases like? How do they come about? What are the actual offenses that the victims suffer? And what is it that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers does for the survivors? That's a lot. But just walk us through a case.
Well, let me back up for 1 second, which is that when we do outreach on labor rights, for example, to the labor camps or hold community meetings on the issue, education meetings, we don't discuss human trafficking or forced labor in a vacuum or in isolation, because we didn't actually start out as an anti-slavery organization. We started out as a labor and human rights organization. And in the course of when you're talking to workers, they're not necessarily separating out that issue from all the other labor violations or labor rights. So if you are talking about it out there, in terms of out in the world of wherever it may be going on in your areas, it's within a context of labor rights in general rather than in isolation. You are going to get a better understanding of people are going to be listening more and understanding the context that it might be happening in, because it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens where in a degraded labor environment where other things might already be going on that aren't as extreme as forced labor, like low wages or substandard working conditions, or a situation where there's a lot of layers between the worker and the employer, in terms of many different middlemen. But and I also wanted to even address Regina's question issue that you all both brought up about, and World Vision too, about just like with a sex trafficking victim, workers who are held against their will they suffer a loss of control over their lives. Very similar situation where slowly they're realizing they don't control any element of their life, and once they escape, and for a service provider this is good to know, or once they are rescued, they don't instantly regain control over their lives. It's a process. It takes time. And to give a quick snapshot of a case, if you look at the one that the museum is about, the reason the museum is in a truck similar to a U-Haul truck is because it involved workers who were housed in the truck, locked in at night, padlocked in there at night, and who had to escape, and included physical restraint when they were out in the field. So we've seen a range of cases involving threats to your family, saying, if you leave, we'll hurt your family back in your home country, in the case of immigrant workers. We've seen cases involving guards, armed guards, or guards with cell phones, or informants placed in each house in a labor camp that control your movement or watch your movement. Beatings, shootings, pistol whippings. So those include the violent incidents that are done in front of other people to one worker so that everyone else sees, and they think, oh, this may happen to me if I try to leave without working off my debt. So it can range from psychological coercion all the way to, rarely, physical restraint, but it would have even elements of both, really.
And can you say a word about debt servitude? I mean, this seems to be at the heart of so many trafficking, but especially labor trafficking cases. What is that concept about?
Debt is a way of, as what you'd call the enganche, or the hook, a way of keeping people thinking you may not leave, or you cannot leave until you've paid off your debt. And what the worker would often, workers often are perfectly, they would be willing to pay off this debt, whether it be for transportation or for the debt that builds in an old style company store labor camp, which you still often see with American workers, where your debt builds from food, rent, what they charge for rides, all different kinds of charges that can build up. And you're to pay off this debt before you can leave. But then the debt just keeps mounting and mounting and mounting, and somehow never gets paid off. The deductions keep building, the prices are inflated. Let's say maybe a ride from Arizona to Florida would be $1,000, something like that. And you would be, oh, you can work this off in a couple of weeks. Well, before you know it, you're there and you're earning maybe $5 a week or $20 a week, and then you realize, no, I'm not going to be paying this off in a couple of weeks. And the workers tend to not think, I don't want to pay the debt. They simply think, like anyone else would, well, I want to go work elsewhere to pay this. Just like when you work at, say, let's say you buy a truck and you have payments to the dealer. Now, do you think you have to work for the dealer before you've paid off your truck? No. Well, in that's the same situation in the sense that that's what will trigger oftentimes the violence or the threats, is someone saying, well, I want to go work elsewhere. And then all of a sudden you realize, I'm actually being held here against my will.
And what's striking, and Laura mentioned this, we see this, of course, with foreign national victims that owe a debt at times perhaps for being brought into the country. But curiously, we also see it for U.S. citizens. We've seen a major case up in the Jacksonville area, up in Palatka. It's called the Evans case back in 2006. And it involved, strangely, targeting African-American men and women from homeless shelters in Jacksonville, in Tampa, Orlando. The trafficker went as far west as New Orleans. And he looked for people that had a substance abuse issue or an alcohol abuse issue. And they were then transported to Palatka, Florida, held in somewhat remote camps, and then paid every night in either crack cocaine or in alcohol. That, in other words, the trafficker preyed upon their vulnerability. So they were not undocumented immigrants. These were U.S. citizens, but it was almost the perfect trafficking case because no one missed them. They were from homeless shelters. And it's a reminder that at the end of the day, it's really about these kinds of vulnerabilities that people have, both foreign national and our own U.S. citizens as well, that we've seen exploited here in Florida. If we could go to Jennifer, say a word about the kinds of services. First of all, it's striking that all the people up here on this panel represent non-governmental organizations. We call them NGOs, and that's a critical part of the anti-trafficking movement in the United States. That it's critical, of course, that law enforcement and prosecutors know about trafficking, have good tools to effectively prosecute traffickers, but it's the NGOs who, at the end of the day, care for the victims. And say a word, if you could, Jennifer, about where are the victims coming from that World Relief has worked with, and actually, what is World Relief? Tell us a little bit about World Relief as an NGO.
World Relief is an international and national Christian nonprofit organization. It is actually the humanitarian arm of the National Association of Evangelicals. And in addition to working overseas with orphans, widows, disaster relief, here in the United States, World Relief also assists refugees who are fleeing violence and persecution, and helping them to be incorporated into the communities. Oftentimes, really looking toward the churches. Our mission is to equip the church to care for the vulnerable, to equip, to be there, to welcome the stranger. And so another component of what World Relief is doing in the United States, in numerous offices, including here in Tampa Bay, is helping human trafficking survivors, because there really isn't a more vulnerable population, and really trying to see how the community and the church can come together to meet the needs and help. Basically, I see it very much like the Good Samaritan. Many of us are familiar with that story. And many people walked by the man who had been beaten and left naked in the ditch. And I think when I go to work each day, my mindset is always, I want to be the Good Samaritan who is going to reach into the ditch and not just say, hey, how are you? Are you okay? Like, you're going to be all right, give you a pep talk, but let me take care of your medical bills. Let me get you to the doctor. Let me see what I can do for you. Do you have clothes? Do you have a place to sleep tonight? And I think that, our organization here in the Tampa Bay region is really just dedicated. We're small, but we're fierce, fiercely protective of the people that we're serving. And in terms of labor victims, really in the past year, we've had more domestic sex trafficking victims than labor. But in prior years, and actually that's due in part to the fact that prior to the last year, we weren't actually servicing domestic clients. That is a new component of our outreach here in the Tampa Bay region. But prior to that, we had been servicing largely, labor trafficking victims were the majority, whether they were from the Philippines or Guatemala or Mexico, a variety of places, Haiti. But, the common component in many of these cases is forced labor situation. We've had individuals who were actually quite skilled. I know what Terry's been speaking of is so true about Florida, that literally 44% of our entire economy is service-based. And when you think of Florida, you think tourism, agriculture, and servicing the elderly. Really, when you start really looking at where the dollars and cents are, and all of those industries have the capacity to really to provide inroads and provide wide open opportunities for traffickers to exploit cheap labor. And then if the public isn't aware, then how can we really rise up and demand equal treatment and demand humane treatment, no matter whether someone's from the United States or from Haiti or anywhere else, that what will be our baseline expectation that every human being deserves to be treated a certain way, and we're not going to tolerate it, we're not going to purchase products from that company, and we're going to take a stand. And so a lot of what we do, in addition to providing overall case management, and I'll just kind of tick through that quickly, what that means is when we get a client, often through law enforcement, sometimes through other agencies like Gulf Coast as well, then we sort of do a comprehensive analysis of what that individual's needs are. And the needs are always pretty great, no matter what type of human trafficking survivor you're talking about. And then really kind of seeing, okay, here are the needs. What does this client want? Because their whole experience has been one where every bit of power has been stripped from them and someone else has controlled them. So how do we not become another force like that in their experience, that we're not dictating to them? How do we empower them to let us join with them and help them in their recovery process? And that always is going to include medical care. Everybody wants to see a doctor, and if they have ailments, to be able to get well. It's a very important part of their having any type of future for any of us. Trauma therapy, we definitely see that as just a key need and key component, and we always encourage and try to get all of our clients linked in with those services. Very important. Legal advocacy, which is a tremendously important component of what our labor trafficking victims need and want. Because, remember, with labor trafficking victims, these were just individuals who were in a place where they grew up, where these were desperate conditions. These were conditions where, imagine, you're not able to feed your children. I can't tell you how many times I sit down to eat with my children at night and just think, what must it feel like to not be able to feed your own children? And what length would you go? What risks might you take to be able to put food on the table? And so then they're very vulnerable, and then they're exploited, and great promises are made about how they are going to be able to send money back. Their child is going to be able to get an education. Their child is going to be safe. And then, of course, the trafficker, turns around and completely tricks them. And so kind of helping them sort through and build trust again is another piece that I think NGOs play such an important role, and particularly just in entering in, pitching a tent. I like our CEO of World Relief talks about this concept of going to where the suffering are and pitch your tent. Live and love and care and enter into their suffering and help them to get the services that they need to get better. So I don't think that answers
Great, that
the
does.
question.
Let's take that same question too, and let me throw that at Kathleen in particular. The immigration needs that specifically require an immigration attorney. If you could say a word, Kathleen, about continued presence and about a T visa. We hear these terms kind of thrown around. These are absolute needs that our foreign national victims have. And then talk to us too a little bit, Kathleen, about what are some of the complexities or the challenges of working with those victims.
Okay. One of the things that I wanted to address that was talked about a little bit earlier, and that is about identifying the victims of labor trafficking and maybe why that's a little bit different than the sex trafficking. And I think part of that is because a lot of the clients that I have represented, their labor trafficking was a direct result of their U.S. visa status. So they had visas. They were here lawfully in the United States. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of people maybe don't realize is you can be a victim of labor trafficking and you can have a lawful U.S. visa at the same time. And that is exactly what we're seeing a lot of the time. And I think the three visas that I see the most, and Lori, maybe you can back me up on this, is H-2A visas, H-2B visas, and J-1 visas.
Could you repeat that?
H-2A, H-2B, and J-1 visas. So our visa categories in the United States are all letters. That's just the way that it is. The H-2A visa is a seasonal agricultural worker visa. Typically, it's for 3 months. It can be extended, 6 months, 9 months. H-2B visas are seasonal workers, so it's not necessarily agricultural work, but it's considered seasonal work. Recently, I've seen a lot of restaurant workers and resort workers on H-2B visas. So if you've gone to the Don Cesar, I promise you that a lot of those people working at the Don Cesar are on H-2B visas. The other visa category that I see a lot are J-1s. And J-1s are, it's called the cultural exchange visa. All of these visas have to be approved outside of the United States by the Department of State. So all of these clients are originating outside and being brought in lawfully into the United States. But the key to all three of these is that you are tied to that employer. If you walk away, if you quit your job, your visa status is automatically terminated. And employers, what they will do is, of course they understand and know this, and in a sense they are required by the Immigration Service to tell them whether or not somebody has left their visa status. And so basically what they say is, if you leave, you're out of status and I'll get you deported. Well, that I'll get you deported part is maybe a little less true, because that's a more of a complicated issue in getting them actually deported by Immigration and Customs Enforcement. But so the point I want to make is that the visa status that a lot of the clients are on is directly related to why they're in the trafficking situation to begin with. There's another component to it, and it's the recruiters. So there are recruiters outside of the United States that are recruiting for these employers here inside the United States. For instance, somebody says, I need so many workers at this resort, I need 50, or I need 100. So look for that amount of workers to get an H-2B visa. And so the recruiter in the third country, let's say Mexico, will go around Mexico to recruit. So for instance, I once saw a case where the recruiter was recruiting H-2B visas to work in a fish packing plant in the Tampa Bay area. And they were very specific. They targeted women, so they were all women, and they all had families. There was not a single one of them that didn't have a child or a husband back in the home country. And they were brought here on their H-2B visas. They worked in the fish packing plant. They didn't realize that housing wasn't going to be paid for, and they also didn't realize the housing conditions were really not going to be what they thought it was going to be. They were all placed in a 2-bedroom house. I think there were about 20 of them. So in the beginning, you know, it was for them a shock. They also were charged the transport fee every day to the factory, which adds up. And so at the end, even though they were making minimum wage, which they were told about back in the home country, I think actually they were told they were going to be making about $8.50 an hour, which to them is a lot of money. Even to a lot of U.S. citizens, that's a lot of money. But what they didn't realize is that they were going to be charged for the housing, how much food costs here in the United States, transportation, etc. So when these ladies came to me, their request was they wanted to change employers. They wanted to leave the job they were in. They didn't want to stop working. They wanted to continue working, but they didn't want to work for that employer. And at the end, when their visa status could not be extended, they didn't have enough money to go home. Like, they actually couldn't afford to return home. So that's just one example of some of the, how the visa plays into it. I think the other thing that people should know is there's a lot of people who do get H-2B, H-2A visas, these temporary visas, and they return home, and then they get them again, and they return to the United States, and so it's a lifestyle for them. But the thing about it is the recruiters have an enormous amount of power, and they have what we call blacklisting. And so if you're blacklisted by recruiters in the third country, what that means is you're never going to get a visa again to come into the United States. Like, they will make sure that you're on the blacklist. And I've seen, I've heard that a lot of the settlements, for instance, with the civil suits include a provision, it's a confidential provision, that says you will not blacklist. It's totally unenforceable, I think, here in the United States, but that is actually written in to the settlement, because blacklisting is a threat, and it's a viable threat for a lot of the workers that are on these visas.
Catherine, say a word. What does continued presence and then a T visa do for an undocumented victim?
So continued presence is sort of, immigration wouldn't want me to call it a status, but I don't really know how to explain it to non-immigration people. But basically what it means is you're deportable, but we're not going to deport you right now. We'll give you a certain amount of time. Continued presence is supposed to be only granted by federal agencies, but I've only ever seen Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in fact, ask for continued presence and receive it. So for instance, local law enforcement, let's say I have somebody who is undocumented, there's an investigation going on, I ask ICE, I need continued presence for this person, and what it does is it gives them work authorization, and it also gives them valid status here in the United States so they won't be deported. Well, you'd wonder why that is so important when a lot of times maybe ICE is even involved in these investigations. But I have had clients who were involved in investigations, had continued presence, were trying to go from Tampa to Orlando, were in a Greyhound bus station, were stopped by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, asked to show their documents, and if they didn't have them, they were placed in deportation proceedings and deported. And I've had groups of clients where some of them had continued presence and thus were in this category where they at least were not going to be deportable, and others that did not, that ended up getting caught in other places in Florida and were deported. Even though same group of survivors, it's just that I was able to get in contact with some and not with others. So the continued presence is really for law enforcement. It's all about law enforcement. It's allowing the person to stay here while the investigation is ongoing. But ICE will not extend that if the investigation is complete. So it's only while there's an investigation going on. It's typically only for 1 year, but it is renewable as long as the investigation is ongoing. The T visa, that's the mechanism that we use basically to encourage people to come forward and work with law enforcement. So Congress made the deal, and the deal is this. Okay, there's a visa. You are eligible for it as long as you cooperate with law enforcement and everything that they ask you to do that's reasonable. And so that's part of what an immigration attorney, why an immigration attorney, in my opinion, should be called in from the beginning in some of these cases, in all of these cases, is to explain to them the deal. The deal is this. You cooperate, you remain eligible. If you don't cooperate, you're no longer eligible for the visa. And the visa is good for 4 years, and only 4 years. And it typically can't be extended unless there is an ongoing investigation, which I have not yet seen happen past the 4 years. But it does lead to lawful permanent residence. It can lead to lawful permanent residence.
When we talk about this continued presence and this T visa, it's very important to notice, Kathleen does, that actually Congress created that primarily for law enforcement. It was the idea that we need victim witnesses to actually testify against their traffickers so that they can get that 1 year or so of continued presence while an investigation goes forward. And then typically after there has been a case, after there's been a prosecution, ideally, that person is eligible for a T visa and that path towards being a permanent resident. But we don't actually make it available to all of our victims. I mean, if it were a true human rights mechanism, we would give it to every victim. We only give it to the victims that are at least willing to take part in a law enforcement investigation. Laura, let me ask you, why would people not want to be part of a law enforcement investigation? Why would someone not be willing to take part in that?
Well, there's a common, misconception that people say, oh, people don't want to come forward to law enforcement in the U.S., and I'm speaking here of immigrant victims, right? Because of how law enforcement is in their own country. I want to say that it is not that simple. There are plenty of people here who have actually seen law enforcement here as somebody they desperately were trying to contact. We have 911 calls where people will try and reach local police, and then they may show up and misidentify the situation, and you might have the trafficker present it as this is a domestic violence incident, this is family-based, when really no one he's controlling is his family, for example. Or you might have a police officer show up when a worker has tried to report a beating, let's say, over a debt, and it just gets classified as simple assault, something like that. In fact, the reason people would fear going forward with law enforcement is something a little more subtle, which is the threats, sometimes threats to your family in your home country are more powerful than any kind of weapons that are used here. In other words, the cases we've worked on, the slavery operations that have involved weapons, were actually prosecuted and successfully prosecuted. And one of the most difficult cases that was not able to be prosecuted was one where none of the weapons were here in the U.S. The traffickers controlled workers by having enforcers in each unit of the labor camp, or the housing camp, that were from their home area. It happened to be a home area of the country where there wasn't law there, in use. It was a lawless region between Guerrero and Oaxaca and the mountains there. But the traffickers' reach down there was that they did kill people down there, and everyone knew it. And so we actually had people who asked for our help in escaping, who left the camp, and when the traffickers called their parents to tell them they better get back here, they actually went back in. That was one of the harder situations when you know something's going on, but obviously humans have to testify. Unlike a drugs or arms case where you have evidence, here's the drugs, here they are. You need to have human testimony, and you need to have people feeling like they can come forward. Well, people explained to the workers, well, we could move you to another area of the U.S. You could have a different job. You could have your children come up on a TV set. This is technical, but it's TV set derivative, it's called. And they said, well, we have extended family down there. There is nothing, a T visa offers protection in a sense, but when people are, they're not doing that, when people are stepping up to try and see justice done, it's not for that T visa. That is something that comes that is a reasonable protection to offer someone who's standing up there in front of their traffickers, say during a sentencing hearing or something like that. But when you know that still the traffickers could kill people in your own country, it was not enough of a, it wasn't able to overcome their fear so that they could go forward.
And we find that a lot of our victims are from countries where they don't trust law enforcement, where in fact law enforcement is there to, again, extort you or do all kinds of things to you. If law enforcement is at all corrupt in the victim's home country, they of course attribute that same type of thing to law enforcement here, so that the very people that might be able to rescue them in the United States are people that the victims fear. And we encounter that in a number of different situations as well.
Terry, I actually have seen a case where the recruiters back in the home country were already conditioning the clients, because they knew what was going to happen to them, and told them, do not contact the police in the United States, because if you do, they're just going to arrest you and deport you. So their conditioning was already happening back in their home country. They had this sort of cultural session where they were telling the clients what they could expect in the United States, and one of them was absolutely never contact the police in the United States.
A question for Regina, if I could. Regina's got great background in that she's worked both on the non-governmental side, but also worked on the governmental side too. Worked for a number of years. She was actually our first statewide coordinator for DCF, looking at what is it that DCF needs to do for trafficking victims around the state. If you could, Regina, what are some of the needs that non-governmental organizations can meet, and what is it that governmental organizations can do, since you've been on both sides of that fence, as it were?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I think that has been talked about a little bit is about the collaborative piece, the multidisciplinary team piece. One of the things, and actually even the government at the federal level is modeling the fact of NGOs, law enforcement, government agencies, non-enforcement related or who don't enforce the law but are also provide benefits and so forth, working together, even just in the grants. For example, if you want to apply for a grant to serve victims, you need to apply with a law enforcement component. If law enforcement wants to go out and apply, they need to apply with a non-governmental organization. And I think that one of the things that we also see in working with the victims, and both Jennifer and Laura talked about, is the victim-centered approach. It's about having the victim guide the process. And so if you think about, these are individuals whose freedom has been taken away, whether it was physical freedom, in that way it was restricted, or freedom of choice, the control part that Laura talked about. And in us coming in and either rescuing them or identifying, taking them from that situation, we want to restore that. And of course, they're not familiar with the process, right? And we're so many agencies and so forth, but we're there to guide them, to explain it, and so forth. So working, going back to the original question about working with the NGOs and government and so forth, they each provide, some of it is complementary and some they have very distinct roles. So for example, the non-governmental, as I'm now working for an NGO, one of the things that we do, as Jennifer talked about in detail, is about the supportive services. We're funded to be able to provide services to a victim for maybe up to a year at a time. Government doesn't have the funding or capacity to do so. So as law enforcement is doing the investigation and hopefully the case goes to the prosecution, that's what the NGO is there to do. The housing, whether it's provide transportation to those meetings or appointments, the medical care, whether it's find pro bono healthcare providers or if there's a sliding fee, be able to provide it. Sometimes victims need emotional support. A lot of times they need emotional support. So it's being there, whether it's on a weekend or, an evening. And I know law enforcement agents who do this as well. So it's not just something that the NGOs do, but just being there and providing things like life skills. We have clients who, if they were 12 years old or young when they were trafficked, and then they are now, quote unquote, an adult because they've turned 18, maybe there's that gap in schooling or gap in the life skills piece, and now they need to know how to write a check, balance a checkbook, take a bus ride. So that's what the NGO does, that supportive piece. The government part, and talking not so much law enforcement, but having, for example, worked with the Department of Children and Families, has mechanisms to help that. So, for example, in the case of DCF, apart from foster care, which is the great piece and what we worked on, which is providing a mechanism when child trafficking survivors are identified in providing housing and long-term care, they do have the part of the public benefits. So trafficking survivors are entitled to medical assistance as well as SNAP or food stamps, so food assistance and so forth. So they have that mechanism. And agencies such as DCF, because DCF is our largest state agency, has programs for homelessness, has programs for domestic violence, has all these different programs which can aid a victim of trafficking and serve as an extra resource. So we're all working in partnership to provide this kind of comprehensive and wraparound, services to someone who, it's basically everything was taken away from them. So I like when someone tells me, so what do you provide? And I'm like, well, think about that someone was removed from a raid or from a camp and they come to you. What do they come to you with? Nothing, just the clothes that they're wearing. And so you're there to all of a sudden provide everything from a toothbrush to, help them navigate through this system that is ever-changing and ever-evolving and very complex, and there's always new players and regulations change, the laws are reauthorized, and we're helping to make it as smooth as possible with the NGOs, with law enforcement, with government agencies at every level involved.
Here's the thing. Oftentimes you'll hear about bureaucratic turf wars or who's going to get this credit for this or that. If this case or investigation doesn't involve as many as I can think off the top of my head, just one case involving a dozen workers that we know. It's a dozen workers, 2 states, but that's not even, that's not an inordinate amount of people who were being held against their will in this particular operation. There were at least 12 or 13, both law enforcement and NGO organizations who worked on that case in order to see that those workers gained their freedom and that the traffickers were put in jail. And in that sense, there can't be these egos or turf wars, and law enforcement will get intelligence or information from NGOs, and the NGOs will have obviously the support of law enforcement in order to get what the worker or victim says, which is, I want this person put in jail. Well, it's going to be law enforcement that does that. So we had a situation where it was our organization, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, Collier County Sheriff's Department, both had workers escape from a place and come to, some met up with a road patrol officer in town who recognized when they said we were being held against our will, they knew that that wasn't just something that doesn't happen anymore in the 21st century. In the same way, when some of those workers in the same operation made their way to our office and said, we would like to change, we would like to leave our boss, change bosses. Well, why would you like to do that? And they literally held out their wrists, and you could see marks from where they'd been restrained. Well, what kicked into gear then? Is that going to just be the Coalition of Immokalee Workers and the Sheriff's Department dealing with this? No. There was then housing, which would be, which was a faith-based housing, St. Matthew's House down in Naples. There was emergency food. There was the U.S. Attorney's Office who got involved, then in terms of, and U.S. Department of Justice whom we contacted. Then ICE and FBI and DOL were all the investigative agencies, working with those prosecutors. Then there was some of the workers, one of their vulnerabilities was substance abuse. So there were substance abuse centers contacted and involved, and who had to be Spanish language substance abuse counseling centers. And then translation. Well, did everyone speak Spanish? No. Some people spoke Mixtec. Well, we located a translator in California who speaks Mixtec. Oh, yes, we know. We've got this. We know this translator. It turns out there are actually 53 different varieties of Mixtec. And it wasn't the one that the translator spoke in California. This is just, I'm just, because it's not all neat, like the little diagrams or the case studies or case management charts. It's very organic. It can get messy, but completely worthwhile, the work that everybody here is doing.
That's great. Talking about the complexity, let's turn the discussion just to the notion of gender for a moment. I'm acutely aware that I'm the only male up here with the whole certain group of experts here. But one of the things I noticed, it was a couple years ago, the FBI had called me out to actually conduct an interview for them in Spanish of a farm worker that had been actually held and detained and actually pretty horrifically exploited. And as I interviewed him in Spanish, I mean, he had marks all over his face, and I remember asking him, what happened to your face? I mean, what is this about? And he told me how he had been, had to work 60 hours a week, and actually was being held in a camp far away from the nearest highway. They were locked in every night, about 20 of them forced to sleep on a concrete floor. They were woken up at 3:30 or 4 a.m. by the traffickers with steel-tipped boots who would actually kick them in the face. So he had welts all over his face. And he then went on to tell me how he had actually not been paid. The debt servitude had actually, he was supposed to have earned $500 a week, but between being charged for his gloves and the ride to the fields, the beans and the tortillas twice a day, that he actually owed the traffickers about $200 every Friday, so that he never made any money, and instead his debt continued to go up. And I looked at his face. It was covered with welts, and he clearly had been working for over a year, hadn't made any money, hadn't sent any money home, which really distressed him. He hadn't been able to send money home to his family. But I told him in Spanish, he said, oh, that sounds like slavery. And he was very offended. He says, he told me in Spanish, that wasn't slavery, that was just a really shitty job. I told him, jobs that are that shitty, they don't pay you, they pinch you, they kick you awake every morning, you don't make any money, and you're actually locked in every night. Well, we call it modern slavery. But as a male, he couldn't actually think of himself as a slave, and he couldn't think of himself as a victim either. I mean, we learned some words maybe you don't use with male survivors of trafficking. Just a general question. What is it like to work with male survivors in the different areas in which all four of you have actually served male survivors, especially of labor trafficking? Any reflections or things that you've learned? How do we do it? How do we do it better?
I think that I can think back of a agricultural case that for me, this was a learning experience, even though it had been already many years into serving this population. One thing that was difficult was treating sexual abuse that had happened in the trafficking scheme. That was very difficult, in particular, especially as we were looking at the mental health component, as we're looking to the health component itself in treatment and things like that. It was you could see the victims not accept or not not want to talk about what had happened, despite the fact that we're having doctors telling us, listen, we can tell based on the exam and so forth and so on that they were sexually assaulted. It was kind of like shunning the kind of blocking the information and so forth. And then looking long term at therapy, that was something that, of course, not acceptable. That's not something that, as we were discussing the service plan, that they wanted it to be there. So we found a couple of things worked Number one, we thought, well, they might not, and we've been lucky enough to have both male and female case managers. So we thought, well, maybe they don't want to speak to another man about, sexual abuse or so forth, but they felt more comfortable in speaking with a man than they did speaking with a woman, especially in, Hispanic culture in this particular case. And the caseworker was able, he had a background in training on this, which also helped, and he was great in explaining therapy, but not as therapy per se as what we talk about in counseling of dealing with, traumas. Not phrasing it that way, but just, it's somebody else that you could talk to, somebody here if you need anything, especially one of the victims started having nightmares and things, of course, because the trauma starts coming, forth in different ways. And first, he started talking just to him. He felt very comfortable. Once, particularly this victim, started feeling very comfortable with the case manager and started telling him a little bit about that. And then that was able to open the doors to a male, though, therapist. So that was very interesting to us. And that was an experience, and we've been able to, as we've had other cases with similarities, to take that model, and that seems to have worked. Apart from that, I don't see many distinctions between the labor, or at least from, working with foreign-born victims, between the men and the women. It was just in that particular area that for us it was a first, and there hasn't been a lot documented in, like you said, the case management flow chart or anything like that, something that just to show us how to work. It was just seeing, trial and error. So that was the best practice and lessons learned for us.
Laura, your thoughts?
Well, I think violence is one of the tools used to obviously control people. So it can be violence that does not have as much stigma in our society to talk about afterwards, like being beaten or pistol whipped or shot. If, say, the males in a modern-day slavery operation, and perhaps against the females while they are being held in forced labor, so it is not sex trafficking. Sexual violence is used against the women, and also against the men, but I'm speaking of in general in these cases. It would be just using any kind of violence that makes you lose control. The difference, of course, is in our society, it's harder afterwards when it's sexual violence to speak up about it because there is more stigma attached to it for many people in terms of being able to tell their family or future spouses, that kind of thing. It all becomes much more of an issue. But for the males who suffer from having someone beat them or pistol whip them, there is a tendency to say, if you ask a trigger question, were you afraid? No, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid. That is can be somewhat of an automatic response. So the way you as labor trafficking service providers interviewing or talking might ask, well, were other people afraid? What happened to other people? What did you see happen to your peers when they, try to leave or whatever? That can be the first thing that people may want to talk about. This could be men or women. Talk about what happened to other people first, and then it may come around to how it is you felt and what actually happened to you. And in some cases, it can be as much as a year later that someone may say, I'm still having nightmares about my boss coming after me with a machete. But that was not said in this one situation until a year after the person had escaped.
That's a great point. Jennifer, thoughts on male victims that you've worked with?
Well, I'm thinking just of one in particular, and I'm actually going to be with him tomorrow, taking him to the dentist, and thinking about our interactions because we have to drive long distances. And I personally found that just kind of using a sensitivity, recognizing that there can be shame involved for any victim. They can internalize or feel some level of shame. And that you have to be so careful. And I think many of us know this just in our friendships and our basic human relationships, that you don't push somebody, you don't have an agenda. And one thing I always try to do is ask them about their strengths, like not ask them about their trauma, ask them about what they're good at and what they like, and maybe what they've had training in the past, and what some of their future goals and dreams might be, and what they wanted to be when they were 5, or just kind of try to build up their sense of confidence in we all like to share something that we're good at. If you have a natural talent, or you've had training in something and you feel really gifted in that, even though your trafficker had you doing something completely different and demeaning, and you were exploited and abused, that doesn't take away your gifts, you know? And so I think sometimes that just basic human sensitivity is very helpful. Whether or not they'll ever communicate their victimization and some of those details to me or to anyone in that role is only if they ever want to, you know, completely based on whether they feel comfortable. Maybe it will someday be with a therapist. Or maybe it will be with another, you know, let's say that individual's from Guatemala, and maybe they're going to meet someone else in the community from Guatemala who's not related to any of that, but just, you know, because people find a way sometimes to find people that they have things in common with. And maybe it will be through those relationships completely apart from World Relief, you know, but as they build community, that they will be able to speak the same language, not just linguistically, but culturally, you know, and things may be more comfortable to come out. But I think it's really not having an agenda and just having them feel like, you know, you're looking into their soul, and we're all good down there, right? You know, looking into their goodness and their gifts and letting that bubble out, and then sometimes that can break down some barriers too.
And Kathleen, you mentioned that most of your work currently is with male victims or male survivors.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of your thoughts on?
Well, I hate to make general gender divisions, you know that, Terry.
But go ahead.
The fact is that most of my trafficking clients have been labor, and most of them have been male. And I guess maybe one difference is, but I don't know if this is just because it's labor trafficking, it's maybe a little bit more challenging to get their story. And maybe this is a male thing, one-word answers. I don't know. You might better.
What?
Yeah. But it can be, you know, I spend a lot of time with clients getting their stories. And it's taken a lot of time with particularly my male trafficking clients, labor trafficking, to properly get their stories from them. And I don't know if that's because of the gender or cultural. It's just overall been more challenging.
And survivor stories change over time. I mean, they will disclose more and more. The more they trust us, the more they understand that they can actually say something that won't come back to bite them when they're with law enforcement or with the service provider. So it may also be that.